Okay, so we did the Sui Dynasty, Tang Dynasty. So the Tang Dynasty, what I want you to remember about the Tang Dynasty is it's the climax, the high point of Chinese dynasties. So it's like the best of the best time period in Chinese history. At least that's the way that historians are going to classify it. So things were going really, really well for China at this point in time, and then they start to regress. And what contributes to the regression? Remember, we talked about the Silk Road and cultural diffusion and acculturation. Those are all good things, and those are leading up to this particular point, right? But then after this particular point with the Tang Dynasty, the Chinese start to grow a little bit more inward, right? It kind of reflects that idea of the Great Wall, of separating them from everybody else, right? This disconnect. And whenever you see that, in world history, when a culture starts to separate itself from everybody else, a lot of times they revert. They go backwards when it comes to cultural achievements and cultural advancements. The example we'll look at on Friday is North Korea, right? North Korea with Kim Jong-un, termed the Hermit Kingdom because they are hermit-like in that they separate themselves from the rest of the world. And so life there is much, much different from everywhere else in the world because of that separation. It's different, not necessarily from my perspective, in a good way, a positive way. Okay? So the Tang Dynasty, the Golden Age, they had a powerful army. They're going all different places in the world. There's even some historians that there's some ideas that China actually beat Columbus in discovering the New World. There's some historians that say that the Chinese were actually, venturing across the Pacific and coming up to California and doing those type of things, but we don't necessarily acknowledge that. There's some hints of that stuff out there. Okay, they had wood block printing, so this is quite the achievement, right? Jared Diamond, you guys remember Jared Diamond? Who's Jared Diamond? Guns, Germs, and Steel guy, okay? So in the spring, we'll go back to Jared Diamond one more time, and we'll look at the Inca and his interpretation of the European conquest of the Inca civilization by Francisco Pizarro. But in that little documentary that we're going to watch in the spring, he highlights the printing press as man's greatest invention. You may want to write that out to the side, okay? Now, the printing press that he's talking about is Johann Gutenberg's printing press, and that's in the European culture. And his printing press is what they call movable type printing press, okay? With movable type, what you have is little blocks of letters, right? And then you can take those letters and you could rearrange them in a template, cover it with ink, and then you can mass produce that one particular page. Everybody understand what I'm saying? Right? So that was really advantageous in Europe. Now this one, it's a little bit different, okay? This one with wood block printing, I think it's like just a wood template with the impressions on it, so you can't necessarily move it around, all right? So the Chinese version, I believe, is a little bit of a variation there, okay? However, the idea behind a printing press is that you can mass produce it, okay? So what does that do to books? What does it do to the price of books? It goes down, right? Because the supply goes way up, right? Remember we talked about supply and demand? So a large number of books out there, the price goes down. Then, before the printing press, who could afford a book? Only the wealthy people could, because it's really expensive. Really, really expensive. So a very small percentage of the population was literate. Now you have decreasing costs of books, right? Now everybody can have access to it. What happens to literacy? Literacy rates go way up, right? And when literacy rates go way up, really good stuff happens, right? That's where you get we talk about the variable of time and innovation. You see an exponential advantage here, okay? You did have more Buddhism and Christianity. Want to highlight that idea of acculturating Buddhism. We'll talk more about it a little bit later on in the next couple of weeks before we finish up the semester. But that's a religion that developed in India and acculturated into the Chinese culture. So you have a lot of Buddhist monasteries popping up and influencing social norms. Christianity Christian missionaries going to China, cultivated those ideas there as well. Okay? All right, the Song Dynasty. With the Song Dynasty, you have this concept of Neo-Confucianism. Neo-Confucianism is like a revival of Confucius thought. Okay? It's kind of like the Renaissance. Renaissance, rebirth of knowledge, going back to the classics, going back to ancient Greeks, most of the Greeks, some of the Romans, right? So, you're going back to the Zhou Dynasty and pulling out all the thoughts, concepts, and philosophies associated with Confucius, and you have a revitalization of that type of emphasis. So, you could think of it of a little bit of a conservative shift, a shift back towards the conservative side of culture, right? Because you remember Confucius is all about, guidelines and rules, education, those type of things, those principles. So a little bit more conservative towards the Song Dynasty. You did have some innovations, such as the compass, and you end up getting to progressing from just wood block printing to movable type printing. And then you have the foot binding that's going on there. Put the foot binding in there. The foot binding is not an innovation. It's not a good thing. Foot binding still sometimes does take place in different regions of Southeast Asia, including China. What they do is, at a young age, you start to wrap your feet up, and it's mostly females, wrap your feet up in cloth, and you wrap it up really tight. You do that consistently day after day over the course of time. Because of the tight wrapped cloth, your feet aren't going to grow like they normally would, right? So why would you do that? Any ideas? Why would you do that, Hannah?
So you could fit into different shoes.
I guess you could think of that. Cheaper, cost effective. I don't have to buy any more shoes, right? Maybe. Miss Charisma?
They thought that it was something that was like pretty and attractive.
Exactly. It's all about what is your cultural norms concerning what is attractive. And so it would create a certain gait or way of walking because of the deformed feet. And they thought that way, that style of walking for the males in China was attractive. Sound good? So again, from our perspective in the Western world, we look at it from our kind of ethnocentric ways, and we say, well, that's perverse. That's a human rights violation, right? That they have to manipulate their body in that particular fashion. But again, there are many things that we do in our culture that they look at us and they say, that's perverse. Manipulating your body in that particular fashion. So it goes both ways, okay? Anybody know what movie this comes from? Oh, yeah, it's a good one. The compass that takes you to the thing that you love most, right? All right, the Yuan Dynasty. The Yuan Dynasty is highlighted by the Khans, Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan, okay? Mongolian invasion. So the Mongolians outside the walls, right? They're coming in and they're overrunning the Chinese culture, the Chinese empire. Sound good? So it's like outsiders coming in, conquering it, and ruling it. Now, what I want you to pick up the most here is a lot of times when an outside culture comes in and they conquer, a culture is defeated, the culture of the defeated group usually faces extinction, meaning that it goes away, right? Because the victor is going to take their cultural and social norms and impose them upon the defeated. But in this particular case, it's actually quite the opposite. The Mongols actually assimilated or acculturated a number of the social norms from the Chinese culture and made them their own. Sound good? So this is also the time period in which our guide Marco Polo shows up. You guys familiar with Marco Polo? Read a little biography, children's book to Preston a couple weeks ago on Marco Polo. He spent not just a little bit of time. It's not like he had a quick visit with the Khans. He spent quite a bit of his life, 10, 15, 20 years of his life there. Okay, so he was kind of an outsider while he was there, but he's protected by the imperial rulers and protected in that aspect. Okay, notice down here it says Genghis Khan encouraged merit-based promotions, exempted the poor and clergy from taxes, encouraged literacy, and established free religion. Right? If you really think about those concepts, it sounds fairly familiar to what we have here in the American cultural system as well. Okay. The Ming Dynasty is the next one. The Mongols assimilated into the Chinese culture. This is the only one of the few dynasties in which you see a progression of an individual from a low social status all the way to the very top. So he's climbing up the ladder. So a peasant eventually rises all the way to the point where he's an emperor. Okay, so that happens during the Ming Dynasty. You may want to take a mental note of that. That may be a test question there. I'm not sure if it's that one peasant leader's decision, but after the Ming Dynasty, they start to turn inward and separate themselves from everybody else. So no more culturation, no more cultural diffusion, cultural reversion, going backwards. Okay. The Qing Dynasty, this is the last one. You notice it goes all the way up to the beginning of the 20th century. Now, communism doesn't come in immediately after the Qing Dynasty. They have this time period in which they try out a republic, and that doesn't work very well, so eventually they have that civil war between Shanghai Shek and Mao Zedong, and then they get communism. But the Qing Dynasty is the last one. They have Manchurian rule, so another outside group. China cut off from the West, so again, backwardness, reversion. That limited the creativity, and then the Opium Wars. Okay, let's talk about the Opium Wars for just a second. So, opium is a what? Anybody know what opium is? It's a what? It's a drug. It's an addicting drug. Okay, it's a crop grown. The British were the ones that were growing it at the time. Okay, and they wanted to export it to consumers around the world, and they quickly found that the Chinese culture were susceptible to opium. So they found these high demand over in China. So they started exporting a lot of opium to China through places like Hong Kong. Okay, and the Chinese government, they didn't like that the British were exporting, pushing off this drug that was really bad, right, on their people. And so what happened essentially was a series of wars between Great Britain and China for rights to trade, right? To have rights to access to particular ports. So after this series of wars, who do you think won between the Chinese and the British? The British had the strongest navy in the world at the time, and so the British, they defeated them. And so what did they gain? They gained access to certain ports so that they can export certain products to China, okay? And one of those ports happened to be Hong Kong. So you remember at Hong Kong, out to the side, Hong Kong. Tomorrow we're going to look a little bit more specifically about what's going on in Hong Kong today. But Hong Kong is kind of like a unique section. It was controlled by Britain. It's in China, but it's controlled by Britain for the longest time, okay? And it became almost like an out from underneath British rule a few years ago, but now it's like independent. It's Chinese, it's part of the Chinese country, but it's almost like an autonomous region. So the national government in Beijing doesn't really have authority over what's going on in Hong Kong, but they kind of do have authority of what's going on in Hong Kong. Hong Kong's got more democratic principles in their government that they have in that one particular city than they do in the rest of China. And so it's a whole predicament of what's going on right now. Okay? So we'll watch a video on that tomorrow and get a better understanding of that. But where did all that unrest and difficulty, conflict come from? Came from the Opium Wars. Sound good? Any questions? Clear as mud. Yep. All right.